What if I told you that the grandfather of the director of 1917 was so short that he survived one of World War I's deadliest battles simply because he could run beneath the mist in no man's land? At just 5'4", Alfred Mendes volunteered for suicide missions that would inspire his grandson Sam Mendes to create one of the most visceral war films ever made. But here's what you need to know up front. The story in 1917 is not a direct account of a real event. It's a fictional mission inspired by fragments of stories Alfred told his grandson decades after the war. Today, we're separating the real history from the cinematic storytelling to understand what actually happened and why the filmmakers made the choices they did. Let's start with the man who inspired it all. Alfred H. Mendes was born in Trinidad in 1897 to Portuguese immigrants. In 1916, at just 19 years old, he enlisted in the British Army and joined the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade. He spent 2 years fighting on the Western Front, and his experiences there would haunt him for decades. What's fascinating is that Alfred didn't talk about the war until he was in his 70s. He kept those memories locked away from even his own children. But when he finally opened up, one story in particular captured young Sam Mendes' imagination: the tale of a messenger carrying a single message through no man's land at dusk in the winter of 1916. Alfred's small stature became his survival advantage. The mist in no man's land typically hung at about 6 feet, which meant Alfred, running at 5.5 feet tall, was invisible above it. The British Army recognized this and frequently used him as a runner. Those 2 years in muddy trenches left Alfred with a lifelong compulsion to wash his hands frequently, a physical reminder of trauma that never left him. In October 1917, during the Battle of Passchendaele, part of the larger Battle of Passchendaele, Alfred volunteered for a mission that should have been his death sentence. His company had lost contact with 3 other companies, and battalion headquarters urgently needed a report on their positions. Despite having only completed a basic signaling course, Alfred stepped forward. In his autobiography, published posthumously in 2002, Alfred wrote about the experience with dark humor. He described how German snipers spotted him wandering in circles across no man's land, seemingly so bewildered by the sight of a lone man out there that they shot their bullets safely out of his way. Or, he theorized, they thought him plain crazy. Alfred located all 3 missing companies. He spent 2 days carrying messages back and forth through that hellscape before returning without a scratch. For this act of bravery, he was awarded the Military Medal. He survived the war but was sent home in May 1918 after accidentally inhaling poisonous gas during a German attack at La Bassée Canal. After the war, Alfred became a novelist and short story writer, eventually settling in Barbados, where he died in 1991 at age 94. His grandson would wait until 2017, exactly 100 years after the events depicted in the film, to begin writing the script that would honor his memory. But Sam Mendes has been clear about his creative process. As he told Variety, "I had a story that was a fragment told to me by my grandfather. It lodged with me as a child, this story or this fragment, and obviously I've enlarged it and changed it significantly." The mission at the heart of 1917, where Lance Corporals Blake and Schofield must cross enemy territory to deliver a message that will stop 1,600 men from walking into a trap, never happened. The characters themselves are entirely fictional, not based on specific real people. Even the resemblance to Alfred Mendes' experience is loose at best. Sam Mendes and co-writer Christy Wilson Cairns created a fictional narrative that would capture the essence of the war experiences Alfred described, but they weren't trying to recreate any actual historical event. There's no record of 2 British soldiers undertaking this specific mission on April 6, 1917. But the concept of the mission is rooted in reality. Runners, or messengers, were a critical part of World War I communication. Telegraph cables and telephone lines were frequently destroyed by artillery bombardment, making human messengers necessary despite the extreme danger. However, and this is crucial, the film takes significant dramatic license with how these missions actually worked. In reality, sending 2 men alone across no man's land on a journey spanning miles would have been considered too dangerous. When runners were deployed, they were typically sent in pairs so that if one was killed, the other could complete the mission. But they wouldn't be sent on an extended journey like Blake and Schofield's, crossing deep into enemy territory. According to Doran Cart, senior curator at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, by 1917 you simply didn't get out of your trench and run across no man's land. The threat from artillery barrages, machine guns, poison gas, snipers, and booby traps was too severe. No single individual was going to run across no man's land and expect to survive, let alone reach a destination miles away. Most battlefield communication involved messenger pigeons, signal lamps, flags, and trench telephones. Human messengers were only deployed in desperate situations when all other forms of communication had failed. The film's premise is more thriller than historical reality, but it serves to create a narrative framework for exploring what the war actually felt like. Now here's where the film draws from real historical events. The German withdrawal depicted in 1917 is based on Operation Alberich, and it was a strategic masterstroke that caught the Allies completely off guard. Between February 23 and April 5, 1917, the Germans executed a planned retreat to the Hindenburg Line, a newly constructed and heavily fortified defensive position. This wasn't a panicked retreat. It was a calculated tactical move, designed to shorten the German front by about 25 miles, freeing up 13 divisions for reassignment to other sectors. The devastation left behind was real and intentional. As the Germans withdrew, they destroyed everything the Allies might find useful: electric cables, water pipes, roads, bridges, tunnels, and entire villages. They evacuated as many as 125,000 civilians, sending those able to work to occupied territories in France and Belgium, but leaving behind the elderly, women, and children with limited rations. The reasoning was coldly calculated. More civilians in Allied-controlled areas meant more mouths to feed, draining Allied resources. General Erich Ludendorff later wrote about this decision with chilling pragmatism, explaining they wanted to foist as many mouths to feed on the enemy as possible. The encounter Schofield has with the French woman and baby in the ruined town reflects this historical reality. These were real refugees left behind in devastated landscapes. The Germans also left behind booby traps and snipers to slow the Allied advance. That terrifying scene where Blake and Schofield trigger a trap in an abandoned German bunker? That happened to real soldiers. The rat-triggered explosive was not just a dramatic device. It was based on actual German tactics during Operation Alberich. But here's where the film's timeline has an issue. Operation Alberich took place from February 9th to March 20th, 1917. The film is set on April 6th, over 2 weeks after the operation ended. By that date, the confusion about whether the Germans were retreating or repositioning would have been largely resolved. The film compresses and shifts these events for dramatic effect. The fictional Colonel Mackenzie's planned attack, based on the mistaken belief that the Germans are in retreat, takes this real historical confusion and dramatizes it beyond what would have been realistic by early April. The filmmakers chose April 6, 1917, very deliberately, and most viewers probably missed why this date matters so much. April 6, 1917, was the day the United States officially declared war on Germany and entered World War I. After nearly 3 years of maintaining neutrality, President Woodrow Wilson requested a declaration of war in a joint session of Congress on April 2. 4 days later, both the House of Representatives and Congress overwhelmingly voted to enter the conflict. This was a turning point in the war. Germany now faced the prospect of millions of fresh, well-equipped American troops arriving on the Western Front. The film never mentions this momentous event, and that's actually historically accurate. British soldiers on the front lines in northern France wouldn't have heard this news until much later. Communication was slow, and men in the trenches were focused on immediate survival, not geopolitical developments happening across the Atlantic. That same month would see the Canadians capture Vimy Ridge in a battle that became a defining moment in Canadian national identity. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Russian Revolution was ramping up, setting the stage for Russia's eventual withdrawal from the war. April 1917 was a month when the entire trajectory of the war began to shift. The depiction of trench life in 1917 is one of its greatest strengths. The filmmakers dug approximately 5,200 feet of trenches for the production, just under a mile, and they consulted extensively with military historians to get the details right. Paul Bittis, a British Army veteran who served as military technical advisor, created authentic boot camps for the actors and extras using actual World War I military instruction manuals. He assigned each of about 36 extras specific daily tasks that real soldiers would have performed. Foot inspections, using candles to burn lice from their clothing, filling sandbags for trench maintenance, and leisure activities like playing checkers or chess with buttons as game pieces. What's particularly accurate is the overwhelming sense of boredom captured in those opening scenes. Most soldiers in World War I saw little to no action. Millions were killed or wounded, but the majority of time in the trenches was spent waiting. Defending was easier than attacking, and both sides were locked in a brutal stalemate. Soldiers cleaned trenches, repaired barbed wire, wrote letters home, and tried to sleep whenever possible. The trench system itself was far more complex than most people realize. There wasn't just one trench. There was the front line trench where troops would attack from or defend. Then behind that, support trenches where supplies were brought up and troops waited before moving to the front. Communication trenches connected these positions, and there were separate latrine trenches for sanitation. About 35,000 miles of trenches zigzagged across the Western Front, which itself stretched 430 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. The film accurately shows the difference between British and German trenches. German trenches were generally in much better condition. The Germans anticipated a long war and built their defensive positions accordingly, with deep underground bunkers and even electricity in some sections. British trenches were often more hastily constructed and more exposed to the elements. The mud, the rats, the corpses, the barbed wire, the constant threat of artillery. The film captures the physical and psychological horror of trench warfare with visceral authenticity. The detail of soldiers walking only on duckboards in muddy areas is accurate. These wooden planks were used to prevent soldiers from getting stuck in mud and to help prevent trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet conditions. The depiction of no man's land in 1917 is both stunning and accurate. Alexander Falbo Wild, chairman of the Western Front Association, wrote that the film captured the important realities of World War I, specifically praising the portrayal of no man's land. The devastation was real. Constant artillery bombardment from both sides created a moonscape of shell craters, some dozens of feet deep. The barbed wire obstacles stretched for miles. Dead bodies of men and horses littered the ground, and vegetation was completely destroyed. In some areas, the mud became deep enough to trap and drown soldiers, and could even smother artillery shells before they exploded. The distance of no man's land varied wildly depending on location. In some places, it was as narrow as 15 yards, close enough to throw grenades across. After the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, however, no man's land stretched to more than half a mile in some sections. The Battle of Passchendaele, which heavily inspired the film, was particularly notorious for mud. After artillery destroyed all vegetation, heavy rains turned the battlefield into a swamp. Alfred Mendes called the Ypres salient a marsh of mud and a killer of men. Soldiers sought shelter in waterlogged shell holes because proper trenches couldn't be constructed in the saturated ground. As Alfred wrote, it was a case of taking them or leaving them, and leaving them meant a form of suicide. The scene in the film where Schofield navigates through water-filled craters with corpses floating in them, that was the reality of Passchendaele. The film takes several notable liberties with historical accuracy for dramatic or thematic purposes. Let's look at some of the more significant ones. Number 1. The diversity of the British forces shown. The film depicts black and Sikh soldiers serving alongside white British troops on the front line. Director Sam Mendes stated he wanted to show this wasn't a war fought just by white men, and he's absolutely right that World War I was a global conflict. However, the specific depiction is historically inaccurate for April 1917 in northern France. Tens of thousands of black soldiers did serve with the British Army, many in labor corps roles. The British West Indian Regiment sent 15,000 men from the Caribbean to Europe, but their roles were largely restricted to support and logistical duties, not frontline combat positions. More than 74,000 Indian personnel served and died in World War I, and Sikh regiments fought in brutal campaigns at Neuve-Chapelle, Ypres, and the Somme in 1915. However, after taking major casualties, these regiments were transferred to other theaters of conflict. By April 1917, there would have been no Sikh soldiers in France or Belgium, and it would have been extremely unlikely to see a single Sikh soldier integrated into a British unit as shown in the film. Number 2. The Casualty Clearing Station. In the film, as casualties mount, wounded men are taken to a medical facility just meters from the front line, with tents spread over an open field. This is significantly inaccurate. While aid posts could sometimes be close to the front depending on battlefield conditions, a major medical hub would never be set up so close to the front with no cover. These facilities were vulnerable and critical, so they were typically built in abandoned buildings, underground bunkers, or even shell craters. Keeping them completely exposed would have been unnecessarily dangerous. Number 3. The final British charge. When the whistle blows and the attack begins, British infantry stream over the top in a solid mass with little unit cohesion and apparently no artillery support. This makes for dramatic cinema, but it's not how World War I attacks actually worked. Officers and non-commissioned officers would have been among their men, keeping units together and guiding the attack. Infantry assaults weren't simply picking up a gun and running at the enemy. There was coordination, artillery preparation, and tactical structure even in the chaos. The film was shot to appear as one continuous take, a technical achievement that took 6 months of rehearsal before filming even began. Actually, there were dozens of hidden edits throughout the film, concealed by transitions through darkness, moves behind objects, or moments when Schofield is unconscious. According to Sam Mendes and editor Lee Smith, the shortest unbroken shot was 39 seconds, while the longest single continuous shot was 8.5 minutes. Cinematographer Roger Deakins revealed there are 48 edits total in his commentary on the film. This technique wasn't just a gimmick. It was designed to lock the audience together with the characters in real time, creating the sensation that you couldn't escape. As Mendes explained, it operates more like a ticking clock thriller in a way, and so to experience every second passing with the men seemed like a great idea. The production used incredibly complex rigs and choreography. Most of the film was shot on a single 40mm lens to maintain consistency across the hidden edits. The burning church scene required one of the largest lighting rigs ever built for a film, 5 stories high with 2001K tungsten lamps consuming 2 megawatts of power. The fires themselves were added digitally in post-production. The climactic sprint scene, where Schofield runs along the trench as soldiers go over the top, took 2 days to film and required George McKay to run a quarter mile in full gear. During one take, he accidentally collided with 2 soldiers and fell, but instead of calling cut, he got back up and kept running. Director Mendes kept the camera rolling, and that moment of authentic chaos made it into the final film. Here's what's most important to understand about 1917. It may not be historically accurate in every detail, and the central mission may be entirely fictional, but it captures an emotional truth about World War I that's often missing from our cultural memory. Sam Mendes spoke about being moved on set in a way he'd never experienced before. He said, "I found myself lost on several occasions. It's the first time that I've been on a set and found myself moved by the event that we were depicting rather than anything in the movie. The film was made with genuine reverence for the soldiers who fought. Every extra playing a British soldier was given a real World War I soldier to inhabit, complete with their actual name and service record. Many of these men didn't survive the war. The film is dedicated to Sam Mendes' grandfather, Alfred H. Mendes, a lance corporal in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. The experience of watching 1917, the relentless forward momentum, the visceral danger, the moments of unexpected beauty amid horror, the bonds between soldiers. These elements reflect the fragmentary stories that Alfred told his grandson. While the specific mission is fictional, the fear, the courage, the waste, and the tragedy are all real. Here's something that will put the entire film in perspective. The extras playing soldiers in the final charge were standing in for men who are actually buried and commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The Devonshire Regiment featured in the film has its own war cemetery at Mametz, marking the spot where the 8th and 9th Battalions held positions on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. 153 men from the Devonshires are buried there to this day. Sam Mendes' grandfather, Alfred Mendes, the 5'4" runner who survived missions that should have killed him, who inhaled poison gas and carried messages through hell, who kept his trauma buried for over 50 years before finally telling his stories, represents millions of men whose experiences we can barely comprehend. He died in 1991 at age 94, having lived a full life as a novelist and writer, but carrying those memories of mud and death until his final days. The film 1917 isn't a documentary. It's not a historically accurate recreation of specific events. The mission at its center never happened, but it's a tribute to a generation that volunteered to walk into hell, and many never walked back out. It takes fragments of real stories, real tactics, real battles, and real human experiences, and weaves them into a fictional narrative that helps us feel, even for just 2 hours, what it might have been like to be there. The trenches, the mud, the rats, the corpses, the random death, the impossible missions, the brief moments of humanity amid mechanized slaughter, these were all real. Blake and Schofield may be fictional, but they represent real men whose names we know and real men whose names were lost in the mud of no man's land. If you found this deep dive into the real history behind 1917 fascinating, then you need to subscribe to Fact vs. Film. Every video on this channel does exactly this. We take true story movies and compare them scene by scene with what actually happened. No fluff, no clickbait, just well-researched breakdowns that show you the real history behind the films you love. Subscribe now, and you'll never watch a historical movie the same way again.